I'm going to discuss a very different topic. I am a biologist. I'm going to discuss a topic which has more to do with anthropology, so I will not claim any expertise in this. Yet I think it is interesting, so I hope you find so as well. I'm going to be talking about the dispersal after Babel and the memories people still have of the events before that. Memories people all over the world still have. But before I begin, let's start with some comic relief. This is a conversation which took place, or at least a monologue which took place during the flood. It's not in the Bible, but this is what was said on the ark. Before we entered the ark, a flood skeptic said to me, "You have your faith, and I have my faith. Each faith is just as good as any other faith." Of course, nobody believes that anymore. Pluralism died out temporarily during the flood. So, anyway, the arch history of the world, according to Genesis, is basically like this. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. Genesis 1 and 2 talks about the creation. Genesis 3, the greatest disaster ever, the fall. Then Genesis 6 to 9, the cataclysm of the flood. Then in Genesis 10 we find, very interestingly, the table of nations, in which the sons and grandsons of Noah are mentioned. And these names are very interesting. We'll take a short look at that. Then Genesis 11, the confusion of languages at the Tower of Babel. And then in Genesis 12 it picks up with the story of Abraham. Now Genesis 1 to 11 is the oergeschiedenis, the arch history, the not prehistory, because we have it written down, so it is history, but it's the history of the universe history of mankind. After Genesis 11, starting with Abraham, then the Bible zooms in on one particular man and his descendants, the Israelites, eventually. So, after the Tower of Babel and the confusion of tongues there, mankind started to spread out over the world. And this is basically how it happened. Evolutionists believe in something similar. They think there was an out of Africa migration wave, so a little bit more to the south was the point of origins. Creationists tend to think that Babylon was near where, Babel was near where Babylon was, so it would have been somewhere in the Middle East, and humanity spread from there. Now it is interesting sometimes to read the legends that are still present in many of the people all over the world, which resemble stories which you find in Genesis 1 to 11. And for instance, Tohono O'Hathan, difficult to pronounce, no doubt I'm doing it wrong, but it is a tribe of Indians which live in the south of the United States. They have a story which is very interesting because it tells about the creation of the different tribes, and then a giant flood which occurs. A certain person named Montezuma survives the flood together with his companion, Coyote, the little dog-like creature. And after the flood, they repopulate the earth. However, Montezuma becomes very arrogant, and he says, "Well, I don't need God, I don't need the Great Spirit," that's how they call God. "I'm going to make a big house for myself, and I'm going to be the big rebel, I'm going to be the person who's important and who's in charge." But then the Great Spirit, he thought, "Well, I'm going to thwart all your plans." The big house, it was destroyed, and interestingly, at that point, humans, which originally could talk to animals, could no longer understand animals. So this is a story which you find, a legend which you find in this Indian tribe, and you recognize immediately the similarities with Genesis. For instance, in both stories, or in both accounts, there is a big flood which wipes out almost all humans. There is a phase of rebellion or disobedience towards God after the flood. Just like you see in Genesis, with the Tower of Babel. A large building is constructed, or a city, or a tower. However, the tower, the work is abandoned, or the tower is destroyed, it goes wrong, and some sort of confusion occurs. In the Montezuma story, men can no longer talk to animals, whereas in the biblical story, different groups of people can no longer understand each other. New languages arise at that point. And interestingly, in the Tohono O'odham account, hail and snow and ice appear after the flood. Now Genesis doesn't say anything about that, but creationists do believe that after the flood there is a period called the Ice Age. So even though Genesis doesn't say it, it does kind of fit with the history, the way creationists think it happened. Now this is one example, and it would be interesting to look up this story if you can find it online. I got it from a book, but it's a very nice bedtime story to read to your children, for instance, about Montezuma who survived the flood. Many of the other legends are not as complete, but they also contain memories of Genesis 1 to 11. It's really a worldwide phenomenon. I've been talking too much today. Need some water. Now these legends, which you encounter all over the world, of course, they are not just like Genesis. They're not exactly the same. They have many, many differences. Because stories, especially if it's oral culture, they tend to change over the centuries. So there are many ways in which the stories change. For instance, some of the events are exaggerated or more accentuated, whereas others are forgotten. Some motives of the story they simply disappear, whereas new motives are added. Sometimes different stories are mixed. So maybe a certain Indian tribe has a flood story, and they also have another story, and they mix it together to make a new composite story. The names naturally change. You rarely see a flood legend in which the hero is actually called Noah. Sometimes the name still resembles the original name, but the names generally change. Also, sometimes characters are replaced, so, for instance, or characters are added, like the Coyote in the story which I just talked about. Place names, interestingly, always are local. Whenever the boat, or whatever it is that they survive the flood with, lands on a mountain, it's always this mountain here, right next door. It's never the mountain on the other side of the world, of course. So the geography is always local. So in these ways, the stories can also change. Now deities are adapted to fit the new culture. For instance, many of the cultures may have changed from a monotheistic religion towards a polytheistic religion. So these stories, in many cases, also become polytheistic. Or maybe the story just vanishes entirely because it is not as important anymore in the culture or in the religion of this particular people group. Now, keeping these kinds of differences, these kinds of ways in which differences can appear in mind, let's take a look at a very short flood legend which is found in Mongolia. I'll read it, you can read along. The giant frog, or turtle, well, there's two versions of the story apparently, which supported the earth, moved, which caused the cosmic ocean to begin flooding the earth. An old man who had guessed something like this was going to happen had built an iron reinforced raft, boarded it with his family, and was saved. When the waters receded, the raft was left on a mountain, on a high wooden mountain, where, it is said, it remains today. After the flood, Kaiser Genghis Khan created everything around us. Among other things, he told people how to make strong liquor. Very important detail. But maybe in remembrance of Noah, who also made a discovery in this area after the flood. Now, it's not just flood legends which are encountered all over the world. There are also memories of the Garden of Eden. And I haven't researched this topic myself about the Garden of Eden. I have a book written by an acquaintance of mine in the Netherlands. It's in Dutch, unfortunately, but it contains a collection of all types of legends and stories which resemble Genesis 1 to 11. He gives the following list of legends or cultures which still have remembrances of the Garden of Eden, a sort of primordial garden which existed a long time ago in the Middle Age. So it's interesting to see that it's not just the flood that is remembered in different cultures. Now, the Chinese have a very old culture that goes back to 4,000 years, maybe more. And this has also been a line of research for certain creationists to take a look at the ancient symbols that were used by the Chinese about 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. The Chinese, they have symbols which are composite symbols made up of smaller symbols. So the interesting thing is that the way these symbols are connected, are combined to form a bigger symbol, might be based on the history that was still, they were still aware of at the time that the symbols were invented. So let's take a look at an example. The translation is in Dutch, so I'll translate for you. The symbol for dust and breath and two people and fence, like fence around the garden, together combines to make the word garden, as in the Garden of Eden, for instance. Well, might be a coincidence, but it is interesting. Now, the symbol for a divine order and the symbol of two trees combine together to the symbol of a prohibition. Maybe prohibition to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Also, the symbol for two trees combined to the symbol for woman means it becomes the symbol for desire. And in Genesis 3 we read that Eve looked at the fruit and she desired it. It appeared to be very tasty to her. So, and there are more examples like these. I have a couple of books at home in which they give example after example of these composite symbols made up of smaller symbols in a way that it seems as if the people who made up these symbols were aware of the Genesis story. The name of Eve, the name of Eve, is also encountered in ancient religions of many cultures. Well, for instance, in Egypt, there is Kefa or Kefa. In many cultures, you see that the first woman who ever existed, or the main goddess, or the mother goddess from which the other gods descended, has a name which resembles the name of Eve. So, very interesting, and maybe these religions are partly based, at least the characters are partly based on the true history which is also recorded in Genesis. Now, let's take a look at the flood. If we read the Genesis account of the flood, we see that basically the story goes like this. Humanity is sinful. God gives a warning to a certain person that he's going to destroy humanity. He also tells him to create a vessel. The flood hero builds a vessel. He takes animals on board. Now the flood comes, it destroys everybody except those who are in the vessel. Well, eventually the water is receded and birds are sent out to explore whether the earth is dry yet. Some sacrifices are made as a thank offering, perhaps, towards the deity. A rainbow appears, and then all the people descend from the survivors. This is basically, if you boil it down, the story in Genesis. These are the main things that you find in this Genesis, in this version of the flood story in Genesis. Now, let's compare that to the typical flood story as this secular author sees it. She has published, Mariah Leach, has published the Standard Dictionary of Folklore, Mythology and Legend in 1949. And, well, this is supposed to be a standard work about all types of legends and folklore, etc. And under the item or entry deluge or flood, the following description is given in this dictionary. A worldwide cataclysm during which the earth was inundated or submerged by water. A concept found in almost every mythology in the world. The exceptions are Egypt and Japan. And the deluge stories are only occasional in Africa. The bare bones of the most usual deluge story are as follows. The gods, or a god, decide to send a deluge on the world, usually as a punishment for some act, a broken taboo, the killing of an animal, etc. In a Tsimshian myth, the deluge comes because the people have mistreated a trout, for instance. Okay? Some sin is committed as a reason for the flood to occur, but sometimes for no reason. Certain human beings are warned, or it comes without warning. If warned, the people construct some kind of vessel, a raft, an ark, a ship, a big canoe, or the like, or find other means of escape, climbing a mountain or a tree, growing a tree, floating an island, calabash or a coconut shell, a turtle's back, crab's cave, etc. Sometimes they also save certain things essential to a way of life, such as food, rarely domestic animals. The deluge comes, rain, huge wave, container broken or opened, a monster's belly punctured, water flows out, etc. Bird or rodent scouts are often sent out, but this is not universal. When the deluge is over, the survivors find themselves on a mountain or on an island. Sometimes they offer a sacrifice, not universal. And then they repeople the earth, recreate animals, etc. by some miraculous means. Now, it stands out to me really that the outline of the typical flood legend, as given by this secular author in her dictionary, resembles the Genesis version quite closely, really. I think all the major items which I just listed over here are found not just in the Middle East, but in many other parts of the world as well. So this is very interesting. Could this be because everybody who is alive now descends from people who have actually lived through this? We all descend from Noah and his family, so it makes sense, it fits that in many parts of the world there are still memories of this event. I do have to say that this is less difficult to account for if you're an evolutionist, whether you're a Christian evolutionist or not. Old age harmonization attempts, which means to say people who try to harmonize the millions of years idea with the Genesis account, they will usually say, well, the flood happened, the flood was just a local flood, because the global flood doesn't fit in the conventional geology, so reduce it to a local flood. And then they have to say, well, maybe humanity was only concentrated in the Middle East back then, and they weren't spread out over the world, so a local flood could wipe out all of humanity. Now this is a problem, because even if you do believe in a local flood, somehow, all the mountains were covered, so all the mountains in the Middle East, there are some pretty high mountains in the Middle East, about 5,000 meters high in case of Ararat. Even if something like this would have happened, which seems highly unlikely, we still have this problem. Native Americans were already in the Americas 12,000 years ago. Even worse, Aborigines in Australia were there 40,000 years ago, according to conventional dating methods, which I don't accept, but the long age believers do accept it. So if you accept conventional geology, you're going to have to accept these dates, and this means that if you want to maintain that everybody descends from Noah and his family, which you must in order to accommodate or explain all those legends of the global flood, then you must say that the flood actually occurred more than 40,000 years ago, and that the Babel event occurred more than 40,000 years ago, and that there was actually urbanization and agriculture more than 40,000 years ago, because they built a city, and in order to have a city you need some kind of agriculture to support this population at that location. However, 40,000 years ago we were still in the Stone Age, according to standard theories about ancient man. So this is an inconsistency which is not so easy to solve if you're a Christian and you want to combine your belief in Genesis with the conventional geological ideas about millions of years. Now, suppose you're an evolutionist and you want to explain the presence of all those flood legends all over the world without accepting that there's actual historical core. What are your alternative explanations? Well, let's see. What could you say? Well, you might say that local floods occur every once in a while, right? A river might flood the countryside, for instance, or a tsunami might occur. The local floods occur all over the world every once in a while. So maybe it is the case that those local floods are the actual reason that we find flood legends all over the world. Okay, one possible explanation, right? Well, we'll see how good this explanation is. Another explanation might be that Christian missionaries have for centuries been going all over the world with their Bible and been talking to all those native people, and those other groups, all those cultures, they have taken over the biblical stories and the biblical story of the flood, and they have incorporated it into their own folklore, into their own culture and base of legends. That's another possible explanation. So perhaps there were local floods, and that's the way all these legends originated, or perhaps Christian missionaries brought this story to all those people. Now, let's try to evaluate these hypotheses. Let's take the missionary hypothesis first. Okay, missionary hypothesis. Well, there's a big problem, and that is that flood legends are already found when a culture is first comes in contact with Western colonizers or even missionaries. So flood legends are found in first contact cultures, which shouldn't be the case, of course, if they have taken it from Christian missionaries. So this is a problem. First contact cultures which already have flood legends. Now, another problem is that Christian influences can often easily be recognized in these stories if it is true. And I have read a lot of flood legends, and sometimes you clearly see Christian influences. For instance, you see that the archangel Gabriel suddenly makes an appearance, right? Or Saint Peter suddenly appears in the flood legend. Well, if something like that happens, then you know, well, these have been in contact with some Roman Catholic missionaries, for instance, and they've taken over their story. But these kind of instances can easily be filtered out of the analysis. So if you remove all these stories, you still have a worldwide distribution of flood stories which cannot be explained by the missionary hypothesis. Now, the worst problem, however, is that whereas we have a worldwide distribution of stories about creation, the Garden of Eve, and Noah's flood, we do not have a worldwide distribution of stories resembling events that happened after Genesis 11. And this is very weird, isn't it? If Christian missionaries went to all those people for all those centuries with their Bible, then why haven't they taken over all these other Bible stories, which happened after Genesis 12? Why isn't there a worldwide distribution of stories of the 10 plagues in Egypt, for instance? Or the crossing of the Red Sea, for instance, also some spectacular story, right? There's plenty of spectacular stories which those people might have taken from those missionaries. But this is not the case. So I think that for this reason, especially for the third reason, the missionary hypothesis fails miserably in explaining the worldwide distribution of these flood legends. Now let's take a look at the local flood hypothesis. Here's an overview of stories encountered in different cultures which talk about a global catastrophe. And as you can see, a global flood far outnumbers all the other sorts of catastrophes. There are 19 stories of a global fire, but there are 122 stories of a global flood. Now, it might be that some of these are exaggerated accounts based on the local flood event, is a possibility, but doesn't seem very likely. And why is it that flood stories outnumber the other stories so much? But there are worse problems with the local flood hypothesis. And that is the similarities between the stories. The stories are too similar to have arisen independently from each other. So for instance, the motive that the flood hero takes animals on board of his vessel, whatever his vessel might be. I have I've read a lot of flood legends, and I made a chart and I put a little flag on the world somewhere where there's a flood legend in which this particular motive is encountered. Okay, so now I'll show a map of all the flood legends where the flood hero takes animals on board. So this is not an exhaustive map because I only did so much reading and I was very critical. If there was even the slightest doubt that there might have been missionary influence, or if there was the slightest doubt that maybe it's too different from the Genesis story, then I left it out. And maybe there's lots of stories which I missed. But as you can see, there on every continent we can find flood legends in which this element is included in the story that animals are on board of the vessel. Now let's take a look at an even smaller detail. The detail that at the end of the flood hero sends birds to explore whether the earth is already dry. Now this is a detail, it's a less important detail, it sort of depends on the presence of animals on your ark. So you would expect a smaller distribution of this particular element. It's a smaller detail, therefore it would more easily be forgotten. So this is the map. But still, as you can see, on every continent we see that this motive is present. Well, except Europe, but Eurasia at least. Well, I think it's inconceivable that these sorts of details would be independently made up by people in South America and in Australia. So I think therefore that the stories are related and are not based on local events like a local flood, because then they wouldn't have these sorts of similarities. Now, interestingly, I found a lot of Indian stories among Indian Native Americans, especially in North America, in which they had an alternative version to the bird explorer theme. Namely, in their version, and many of the Indian tribes have this version, the flood hero sends a certain animal, say a beaver or an otter, is that how you say it? Right, what animal that can a swimming mammal. And he sends the beaver to see how deep the water is now. So the beaver dives and he tries to find the bottom, but he cannot find the bottom, it's too deep. So he comes back up. And then he sends another animal, and he can't find it either. And then he sends, lastly, the muskrat. And the muskrat, he dives, and he finds the bottom, and he comes back to Noah, to the flood hero, and he has a little bit of mud on his pole. And the flood hero takes the mud, and then something strange happens, which is not possible, but okay. He takes the mud, he spreads it out over the water, and he blows over it, and dry land appears. And this motive is found in many of those stories among Native Americans, especially in North America. Now, it sort of resembles the biblical story. I have not included it on this map, but you can see the similarities. And I thought, well, it's interesting. It's not birds, it's mostly water mammals, aquatic mammals. And it's not a leaf or something like that, but it's a bit of mud. So it seems like the story has evolved. Maybe I can find more traces of this evolution of the story. Because the original story, I believe, is that the dove brings the leaf, as in Genesis. And the Native American version, among certain tribes at least, quite a number of them, says that the muskrat brings mud. And interestingly, I have found an intermediate form of the story, halfway in the evolution, in which it's a dove that brings the mud, and then Noah does the trick with the blowing. So you can trace back how this story has evolved. Now there are many other details to be found in those legends. Well, for instance, there are a couple of legends which mention a sacrifice after the flood. There are a few legends that mention the rainbow as sort of a promise, or maybe it's not connected to a promise, but the rainbow, it does appear after the flood. What's also interesting, it's not explicitly mentioned in the Bible, but there are quite a few legends which say that the pre-flood world was very different from the post-flood world, especially in the sense that the pre-flood world did not have many high mountains. It was a more level world. And that the post-flood world, all of a sudden there are all these high mountains. Now, the Bible doesn't say this, but it's extra interesting, because creationist theologists do say this. Creationist theologists believe that because of all kinds of tectonic processes during the flood, mountain ranges would have arisen during or at the end of the flood. So this might actually be a real memory of the things that people found out after the flood. No, their world has completely changed. All of a sudden there are all these big mountains. So that might be something that you remember. So interestingly, in several of those legends, we find this detail. Also, in a number of Asian myths, the survivors are brother and sister. Now, in the Bible that's not the case, but sometimes then they have the ethical dilemma. Oh, we have to repopulate the world, but we're brother and sister, can we actually do this? And then sometimes the brother uses a certain trick or to convince her, or a deity says that it is okay or something like that, and then they have intercourse and then they repopulate the world. But this might be a vague memory of the time in which, the first family, Noah and his family, you would have to marry a close relative in the first few generations after the flood in order to increase the human population. So perhaps there are some memories there. Now, as for the name of the flood hero, you do see some similarities, and this picture also is from the book. You see in various regions that the flood hero has names that sort of resemble Noah. And in India there is a different version of Noah. There he is called Manu. Maybe the Nu part of the name is still comes from Noah. And the Manu version has also spread out towards the west. So there are various variations on that theme as well. So I think we can soundly reject the local flood hypothesis in the light of all these similarities between the stories, and it so nicely fits the creation model. Well, sometimes when I give this argument, I get a very strange question. People will ask me, okay, so there was a flood. But why do you think that it's the Genesis version that's the real story? Why would it be, which flood story is true? Why would it be the Genesis story that's true? Might as well be the story you just read from Mongolia, that's the true story, right? So, to clarify, the main point in making this argument is to argue against for the creationist position compared to the evolutionist position. And he has no way of explaining the presence of all these flood myths. So the point is that there is a recent common origin of mankind, and those people from whom we came, they were familiar with this story. And this is only the case under a creation model, not under an evolutionary model. So in the debate between a creationist and an evolutionist, this is a good argument. Maybe it's not a good argument in a debate against a Mongolian person who actually believes his flood story, but that's a different debate. However, I think there are also arguments to say that the biblical story is the best one and most likely to be true. For instance, the Genesis story contains far fewer mythical elements. It's the more realistic story. It's the most detailed story by far. It appears to be almost like a log which captain of a ship would bijhouden. Would keep. Thanks. Also, the description of the vessel is most realistic in the Bible compared to all those other myths. At this moment, there's another lecture going on where I'm sure this is worked out in detail. But basically, it comes down to this. In many of the other stories, it is a canoe or a hollow tree trunk or something like that, or maybe even a pompoen, a coconut, or something like that, in which the flood hero survives the story. Not a realistic vessel to survive a global catastrophe in. There's one other story which gives exact dimensions of the vessel, and that is the Gilgamesh epic, the epic of Gilgamesh. And the flood hero, Utnapishtim, he also has a big ark, and this is what his ark is shaped like. It's a cubic shape. Now, this is a terrible design, because it's not stable at all. It might actually roll over. It will capsize all the time. There's no stability there compared to the ark. The actual ark has been investigated by a Korean institute which designs ships, and they have concluded that the dimensions given in Genesis compared to other possible dimensions make for a very good ship, which is stable. That means it doesn't capsize. Its structural integrity is very good, and also the comfort during the trip is it makes for a more comfortable trip, because the ark doesn't move around as much on the waves as many of the other possible dimensions that you might give to the ark. So that's yet another reason to say yes, the Genesis story, Genesis version, is definitely the best. But also, the Genesis version is the most complete one. I just gave that list of the major events in the Genesis version of the flood. All these events are found in different cultures all over the world. However, if you take one of the other legends and you look at the elements in that story, you don't find worldwide distribution for those elements in that story, except for the ones where he mentions Genesis. Okay, so for instance, the Mongolian story, which I just read, has the earth resting on a giant frog or a tortoise or turtle. Well, this element is found in some villages, but it's not found in all over the world. So it has a more limited distribution. Also, for instance, we can say for certain that as for the evolution of the story, from the dove which brings the leaf to the muskrat which brings the mud, you can definitely say that the Genesis version is the original one, because the muskrat version is only found in America, among Native Americans, whereas the Genesis version is found all over the world, so there's a larger distribution of the story. So, Charco Evenmoor, the author of this book, he concludes correctly, I think, the global flood is historically one of the best documented events. It forms the axis of our universal history. Surprisingly, current history books are filled with events in antiquity that are attested by only one or two sources, while the only universally transmitted theory that is attested by many people groups is hardly ever mentioned. Now, finally, let's briefly take a look at the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel is often is believed to have been in the shape of a step pyramid, a ziggurat. And this might very well be the case, because after the Tower of Babel event, people spread out over the world. And what you see is all of a sudden, independently on different parts of the world, Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in China, you see that highly developed cultures suddenly appear, quite independently from each other, seemingly. This fits, of course, with the biblical history, in which the people spread out from Babel, and some did not settle right away. They may have been hunter-gatherers for some generations, whereas others immediately settled, and they were able to start a culture which was immediately highly developed. And interestingly, ziggurats are something that you encounter in many of those cultures. So, for instance, in Egypt, we see that the earliest pyramids were actually types of step pyramids. Mesopotamia, the Sumerians, they built ziggurats in the 4th millennium BC. That this is evolutionary dating. I don't accept the exact date, but very old, very early. In Sardinia, which is an island in the Mediterranean, there's also the remains of a step pyramid dating from the 4th millennium BC according to conventional dating. In Central America, the Mayans, the Aztecs, the Toltecs, early Native Americans, they also built step pyramids. The Incas did it, several other South American groups did, and also in China, although in the case of China, it's a somewhat later development in the AD era after Jesus, so it's not as early in China. But it's interesting to see that this particular design, the step pyramid, is encountered in so many of these cultures which arose seemingly independently in a short period after the Tower of Babel event. Now, people spread out over the world, and the earliest generations after the flood probably lived to long ages. If you read the Genesis 11 genealogy from Noah to Abraham, then you see that especially the ones who lived lived immediately after the flood, they lived to be hundreds of years old. So the first generations, they lived to a very old age, whereas later generations, they started to die younger and younger. Now, you can imagine that these patriarchs, which gave rise to new families, and also lived to be very old, would have become very famous people within the group they started. And their name would probably be the name of the group. So a certain family would be named after the patriarch of this family. And the people group, which later grew out of this family, would still carry the name of this patriarch. And it is interesting that the names that are mentioned in the Table of Nations in Genesis 10 are found in different parts of the world in ancient records, or in names of ancient cities, or even names of entire people groups. They still sometimes carry the names of the patriarchs, which are also mentioned in Genesis 10. Sometimes gods are named after such a patriarch, for instance. So I'm not sure if you can see, but well, I could show you, if you're interested, from the book. It would be better to look at it right there. And this is, of course, highly interesting and confirmatory of the biblical record. So to summarize, we see a worldwide distribution of legends resembling the biblical history found in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. Garden of Eden, flood, confusion of languages. We find a worldwide distribution of these stories, although I have to say the flood legend is most prevalent. They cannot have arisen independently because of the similarities. They cannot be explained by activities of missionaries, so the only other option really is that the stories are related, and it fits perfectly in the Genesis record. And the similarities stop after Genesis 11. Very interesting. Many of the names in Genesis 10 can be traced in the history of many people groups all over the world. Well, this is not my area of expertise, like I said in the beginning. Yet I find it highly interesting. I hope you found this as well. Please, if you're interested, take a look at this, and maybe I can provide extra references if you want to do some of your own follow-up research in some of these areas. Thank you.
Okay, so this is our last presentation, and I really appreciate you guys all sticking around. We've got a little bit of Q&A still to